MC Fellow and a lead member of the CEDR faculty team, training mediators and mediation representatives internationally. We've also got Harriet Holmes. Harriet's a leading property litigator from Wilberforce Chambers. She's known for acting in complex matters relating to land and associated professional indemnity matters. She was shortlisted for the Chambers and Partners Real Estate Junior of the Year 2021, alongside two other listed people who were more than 16 years her senior. And lastly, but by no means least, we've got Danielle Drummond-Brassington. Danny is a partner and head of the real estate disputes team at CMS. She's very highly ranked. She's known to be a very safe pair of hands, pulling on her extensive experience in all manner of property disputes. So, with that out of the way, I'm going to pass you over to Emily. She's going to lead the discussion, and I hope you all enjoy. Emily, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lawrence. So we've got quite a jam-packed schedule of questions, so I'm just going to go right into them. Mandy, you're actually at the top of my screen, so I'm going to ask you the first one, if that's okay. So the first question, do you think conscious or unconscious bias exists in the legal industry? And do you have any particular experience with this in your career to date?
Wow, what a great question to kick off with, Emily. Well, actually, there's always some statistics that help with all of this kind of thing. And I spent a little bit of time over the last few days looking at a report into diversity that had been produced by CEDA, and eventually I'll manage to put that in the chat, but I'll just sort of show people what it looks like so that you know you've got the right thing when you get there, which is specifically focused on commercial mediation, but actually references the research that the SRA have been doing in relation to actually what the percentages are now about sort of women in the legal profession. And what's really interesting is seeing that change. Because at partner level, the split between male and female is kind of just under 30% female to well over, just over 70% male. And yet at the sort of younger level, at the associate level, it's now a broader split, that sort of 48-52%. Split. Now that's really interesting coming from the independent research from the SRA, but how does that answer your question? Well, I have really seen that growth. And actually, the partnership split, that sort of mostly men with a few women in there, and perhaps that 70-30, was what I saw at associate level perhaps when I first came into the market at Clifford Chance. And I recall being a young lawyer and being a young lawyer in the property sector. Perhaps go, and I've got one particular visual thing in my mind as a very young lawyer entering, and I entered a bit late. It was a settlement meeting. There were 16 people around the table, and they were all male. Every single one of them. I was the only female. I walked in a bit late, and I found myself a chair because they'd forgotten to put one out for me. And I sat down, and I remember having the thought, are there really people like me in this profession? And are there people like me in this sector within this profession? Now that's how it started. But now as a mediator, I'm in a really lucky position. I get a window on all kinds of firms and all kinds of people. And let me tell you, I think that has been a massive change. Yes, I do see that at a senior level, there's still more male than there is female, but actually it's a surprising mediation where it's just all blokes. And often now there is a much more even spread about things. So yes, there's been a massive change, but yes, there's clearly more work to be done, and I'll be really interested to hear what everyone else has got to think today.
Great, that's brilliant, Mandy. I think I'll turn over to Danny, if that's okay, to come from CMS, your perspective.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, to Mandy's comments, I think we've all had that experience. You walk in and you're the only woman in the room, and you're like, right, okay. But do I think it exists? I think it probably does. Have I experienced it? I think in some degree, not sort of overtly. I've been very, very lucky here at CMS in that it's a very safe environment to call it out. And I think, and we'll probably come on to it later, but for me, I've been very lucky to have a sponsor throughout my career. So not just mentors, but a sponsor, somebody who stands behind me and has helped me push up and champion my voice. But when I was thinking about experiences of bias or unconscious bias, actually the lockdown was one for me. And I, at that time, was the only female on the real estate group leadership meetings. And obviously, when we all sent home in March 2020, you didn't know what the hell was going to be happening, helping people sort of set up at home, and we're all homeschooling and all sorts of things. But the partners, the more senior partners, arranged for this almost daily meetings, and they were coming in at noon, 12:30, and nobody else said a thing. And it was like, after day 2, I was like, hang on a minute. How many of you in this room have got kids at home that need feeding at that time? I said, because I do. And why is it me, the only woman around this table, calling it out? I felt like I was just the woman calling it out, but like everybody else was so relieved from it. But that was, looking back at it, that's unconscious bias. That's the guys who haven't got kids at home, who are not in the same situation, thinking, actually, I've got a break between meetings at lunchtime, let's do that. But, and I think it's really important to call it out when you see it. And as I said, I'm fortunate that CMS is a safe environment for me just to call it out as and when we see it. But I ended up doing it at firm level when we were having partner meetings. Again, they were being scheduled at lunchtime. And I was like, I can't be the only one like this. So I emailed the managing partner and said, this is when we're all trying to feed our kids at the moment, because we've all got them at home and they're hungry and they don't care that mummy's got a partner's call, and got them changed to 10 o'clock. But again, I think it is unconscious bias in a way. It's because people are not thinking about it. So that was my sort of recent experience. But I mean, I look back and I have, like Mandy, at the beginning of our career 20 years ago, I mean, when I was interviewing 22 years ago, the advice was, you cannot wear a trouser suit. You have to wear a skirt suit. I mean, can you imagine that now? Sort of saying to people, if you're going to go for an interview, you have to wear a skirt and you have to wear high heels. You just cannot imagine that world ever existed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very true. Thank you for that. Harriet, the last person to speak to the question.
So I suppose I come at this from obviously a slightly different perspective, because I'm a self-employed individual operating in a chambers, and I've got 2 clients. I've got you guys and I've got the lay client. I mean, I kind of came at this from, I think first thing I would say is that in a direct answer to the questions, do I think conscious or unconscious bias exists? Maybe, probably. I'll come on to why I think I'm a bit tentative about it. I think conscious bias may well be there, but has possibly been pushed underground, and query the extent to which that's been sort of pushed underground. Unconscious bias, well, Danny's just given a really good example of that. So there we go, we have it. Have I experienced it throughout my career? I think so. So the way I kind of looked at this first is I went to have a little refresher on stats, get 3 lawyers around a table, and at least 2 of them go to some statistics. And you might be interested to know that the bar has looked at earnings as one way of indicating whether there's bias. And I think it's pretty shocking data that we all need to know about, because we're all ultimately in this legal service industry together. And the stats are pretty horrific. So my work, Property Lit, just like the rest of you, falls into 2 main BMIF, Bar Mutual Insurance Fund categories: Chancery Contentious and Commercial L&T. There's also Resi L&T, but I mainly do Commercial L&T and Chancery Contentious work, which is all your real property stuff and telecoms that doesn't fall anywhere else. And here's a stat for you. Women at the bar doing Chancery Contentious work earn 46% less than men. So for every £1 that your average woman doing Chancery Contentious work earns, your man earns £1.46. Okay, next stat, Commercial L&T. We all think it's lovely and girly in our prop lit world, don't we? We've got loads of women doing property litigation. I turn up at events and there are loads of women around. Commercial L&T, 26%, the men earn more. So £1 I earn, or whoever, £1.25 your man. Now, why did I look at that? I mean, these statistics are complicated, let's face it. And you can't just look at it and say, there we go, obvious bias. It's more complex than that. But surely it can't be the case that all men are always more valuable in terms of their work than women. That just can't be right. So you might have your incidences of like superstar women that earn way more than their kind of male counterparts, but it just can't be the case that every single man doing chancery contentious is valued more than a woman. So that's my example of where there does seem to be something a little bit out of kilter. And that it suggests a couple of things. It suggests that there's a bit of a bias in terms of access to work at the bar. I'm sure we're going to come back to this because, hey, we're all in this together and you refer us work. So, and we work back with you guys. And it also suggests that men are somehow better valued, or possibly that they're getting the higher value cases that pay more. There's complexity here. So on the sort of, does it exist in the legal industry? There's the bar stats that suggest something's wrong. Analyzing the data, it's a talk in itself, and we don't have time for that today. But let's just assume that there's a problem. So then, in answer to your second point, do I think I've experienced it? Well, I qualified in September 2013. My call date's 2011, but there's the usual lag. And I have, even as someone who is, much to my horror, getting more senior, but is still a junior, two things occurred to me on this. The first was that I had one probably quite bad experience years ago before I was at Wilberforce. Walked into the clerk's room, was at the photocopier. Clerk shouts over to me and says, "Oh, you around to do an injunction next Thursday?" And I said, yeah, that's my diary's free. Go by the diary. Carried on at the photocopier, only to realise that my clerk had gone very quiet on the phone in a way that just felt a bit weird. So when I walked back through, I sort of was like, "Was everything all right?" And he said, "Oh, well, I've just had the most awful conversation." And I was like, "Why? What happened?" He said, "Well, they want someone ballsy." Like, oh, I think we all know what that means, don't we? So I sort of went, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Oh, he asked me who else we'd got. He asked me for blokes." Now, this is within the last 9 years. I mean, come on. Not only is that not allowed, but really, and at the end of the day, if that was driven by the lay client, which it may well have been, then there we go. We've got another example of potential problems existing sort of probably societally, but we've got it kind of, I suppose that highlights the importance of us having these conversations and recognizing the importance of all these internal practices that we're setting up to try and stamp this sort of stuff out. What of course happened is that my clerks did all the stuff that they were supposed to do, my former clerks, and basically said, "Well, we're not going to give you a list of blokes. And by the way, if you want someone ballsy, then Harriet's your person," was basically the response, I think. Something kind of amusing like that. But, so it was called out and it was dealt with appropriately. But there's the anecdote. The other is that once someone was telling me that in the context of them going to do some surgery, they themselves, quite a feminist person, said that they had been shocked with themselves when they were introduced to their surgeon that was female. And the reason that they were shocked is because they regarded themselves as quite a feminist person. I think you'll see why I'm telling you this, because it taps into some of the later questions. But they were shocked because their immediate reaction was this feeling of nervousness, that they thought, "Oh, would I have had that same nervousness if I was entrusting my problem to a man?" And so if we're starting to think about what might be going on here, why might there be a problem? Are we, there's that unconscious bias that possibly even exists within women too, especially when you're thinking about entrusting someone's important problem like an operation, or dare I say it, litigation, to someone else. and possibly particularly an advocate, on the basis that that advocate is the person that's there in court doing the fight for, you know, at that crucial moment, the trial. So I'm going to stop there, but there's the way I looked at this, thought about it, and we'll come back to some of it, I'm sure.
That was really great. Thanks, Harriet. I think before I start focusing on specific questions for each of you, there's one more question I was going to ask all of you, which is, I think some of you have covered this in your answers, but do you think you've seen a change since you've entered practice in the legal industry, and where do you see the situation now? Maybe go back to the beginning again with Mandy, if that's okay.
Absolutely. I think Danny, I both talked about the fact that there's definitely been a change. I started in practice before the year 2000, which is now quite a scarily long time ago. And in that time, at that stage, it was not something that was called out. And great to hear by 2010, things perhaps were being called out. And now, hopefully, what we've got in this room is a lot of allies who will take those steps. And not necessarily take those steps because we are the person with the challenge. And I just want to give you an express example of something that happened on one of our training courses. We had 3 lead people. When I say our training courses, I say that. Although I'm a consultant like Harriet, I'm self-employed. One of my little hats that I wear when I'm not being a mediator, maybe once a quarter or so, is I train mediators for CEDA as one of their consultants. And indeed, I've just taken an hour break from a course that's in Switzerland, luckily on Zoom, to come and be here. So it was just on one of these courses, and it was about 6 months ago. So we're talking 2021. A group of 18 participants on screen, 3 faculty leads. It doesn't matter what they were talking about. And one of the participants wanted to make a point and really wanted to reinforce that point. And he began his sentence, "Gentlemen, I'm sure you'll agree that." Now, if he was just talking to the faculty, there was one very senior female member of faculty. If he was talking to the whole screen, there was maybe 45% female. So what do? Do you embarrass somebody? Do you cause discomfort? And actually, what our faculty team did, because one of the things that we talk about is bias, unconscious and conscious, as part of that very important mediator training course, is there was a pause and a silence, and the female faculty said, "I think that was probably addressed to all of us, John," or whoever it was. Let me take that one. And talked about it again later as an example of bias when we did the specific bias training. And again, in the faculty meeting, and it wasn't brought up by the female, the men said, "I was really conscious of that. Thank you for dealing with it as you did. This is what I would have done next." So that allyship is really important. And so that's something that's going on right here, right now, still. And I want to pick up a few other things from that sort of external, what are others saying? And there's been quite a lot of research on that. How do people get instructed? It's all very well and good having 45% of mediators through the course that are female, or whatever the stats might be, getting close to the 50-50 divide. But what happens to the clients when they are instructing? Are they using male-focused terminology like ballsy? And I just want to give you 3 things that are very recent that have come through the door. And they're not attributed by person, but can I just say, who are you looking for? Well, I really want an elder statesman. That implies male. It implies a certain age. And probably white as well, but that's other diversity topics. So that's one we've had very recently. Another one, and I'm reading from a paper because they've not come into me, is, well, when we're looking for a mediator, we look for someone who's most like the senior lawyer working on the case, because then we can't get blamed if it goes wrong. Now, if we look back at the stats that I mentioned earlier about partnership, that means that 70% of the time you're going to be picking a male and 30% a female. So the other thing that we've heard quite a lot of, I'm really looking for someone with grey hair and maturity. Again, likely to be a man. So actually there's these perceptions around how people choose their mediators and perhaps their lawyers, their barristers, that flow throughout that story. And I wonder whether those perceptions are no longer those conscious perceptions, but perhaps that unconscious bias. Yeah. And that unconscious bias isn't necessarily just externally focused. There is perhaps some flavour about us internally having absorbed those perceptions ever since we came out of the womb. And there's a nice women-focused analogy that perhaps I oughtn't to have used. But can I just share a picture with everyone? Would that be okay, Emily?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Because there was a little focus group done by CEDA, and a little word cloud was very quickly produced. Nobody knew that it was a gender-specific thing at all when they were putting the information in. And let me show you what happened. So, it's a word cloud, and can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great. So at the top, you've got the female mediators' words that they use, single words that they were using to define themselves. And at the bottom, we've got the words that the male mediators, as a group, and there was quite a large group, used to define themselves. And what is really, really interesting with all of this is what those words really are. And I just want to pick up two little points here. The women themselves were self-identifying with words such as empathy, approach, calmness. They might be perceived as the more, the less direct and action-focused wording. Whereas the blokes, they tended to put in the more action-focused ability, skills, process. Really interesting. So where does that bias lie? How much of it, whatever we might say, is present in the way we project ourselves as well? And the words that are chosen to define ourselves. So let's see whether those characteristic flavours are changing in ourselves, as well as how we ask for people to sort of work with us. And to the extent that each and every person on the screen can do something going forwards, well, perhaps think about the objective criteria when asking to select someone. Because, for example, if one of your objective criteria is they must be a partner of at least 15 years standing, of a law firm, for example, or indeed a barrister of QC level, for example, then that tends to cross out a whole section of potential candidates who could be really, really good at fulfilling the role.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mandy. Danny and Harriet, do you have anything that you'd like us to add to finish that final question?
What about, have you seen a change in the industry? I think there has. I think for me, it's probably shifted. There was a hell of a lot of conscious back 20 years ago, and it was very obvious sometimes in the office. And I think working in the real estate world, you'd go on site visits and it's there, but I think it is now about calling out the unconscious, the people are not thinking about it as much, or it's just sort of comes up to Mandy's point about the way people use phrases. And I had exactly the same experience as Mandy recently, where again in leadership meeting, the person leading it went, right, gents, and without even thinking, I went, and lady, and I shouted, and everybody was like, whoa, gosh. Just like, no, this pisses me off. I'm calling it straight out. I don't get, but that was totally unconscious reaction. But it's never happened again. But I think we've probably all had, I've been called stroppy. Would a guy be called stroppy, or would he be called assertive? He'd probably be called assertive. And I think it's about, I was talking about psychological standing yesterday on a course about, do I feel safe to stand up and make my view? And the answer is, I am very lucky to be able to do so and be in an environment where I can say that. So I can call it out when someone says to me, stroppy. Would you say that to John? No, you wouldn't. So what would you say to John if he said it in that way? Then that's the same term to me. So I think I'm lucky, but So the answer is it does exist, but it's about your environment. And to Mandy's point, if we don't call it out, it won't change.
Brilliant. And Harriet, are you able to speak to the last of the three questions?
Agree with a lot of that. I think probably, given I qualified like kind of later in the timeline a bit than Danny and Mandy, I think I would say that my experience has been one that fits with the sort of the progressive change that they're describing, because I do recognise that I think probably some conscious stuff may have gone underground, as I intimated earlier. So one example of that being, I remember going to do a site visit in some swanky new apartment block, and the sort of head of massive development company was there, and me and my female instructing solicitor had kind of wandered around the corner to the kitchen area, and around the client comes very experienced elder statesman type figure and says, oh, doing some women's work. And I was absolutely fuming. Oh my God, I was fuming. And I thought, but bloody hell, it's my client. What the hell do I do? And my brain just was like, I am angry. Don't say anything, not immediately. And then I went, not always women. And that was about it, because I just didn't know what to do. And funnily enough, the head of the prop lit department and the very nice firm instructing me phoned me the next day and went, oh my God, we're so sorry. We can't believe the client said that. And I went, it's fine. We kind of handled it. But, you know, there's the kind of the conscious going underground, becoming unconscious. But it's changing. I think it's changing because, and what I would say is this, I think it's changing partly because we're talking about it, partly because we can all work together to sort this out, really. And I agree with so much of what Mandy said, and therefore I won't repeat it. But I'm quite hopeful, because what I see is clients who would have always gone for the bullish man at the bar seem to be going for the hotshot women sometimes too. And why the hell not? But you guys go and explain to them why that's the right choice. Tell them that the ability is there in the females. It's not just some man that you need who can stand there looking tall and elegant in his wig and gown. You guys can make the change too. And this is happening. And so we need to work together. Law firms talk to the bar about the problems and challenges they're facing with dealing with lay clients. The bar talks to you and lets you know the challenges that we face in dealing with this sort of perception of kind of male characteristics dominating the reasons behind instructions being placed where they're placed. We work together, and I know that's not quite the change, but the change is happening, and we can just progress that. So the situation now is one of flux and progress and movement, it seems to me. Anyway, I'll stop.
Can I just gently cut in with the bit that I wear my hat. I've just been wearing my hat on talking to some mediators to be in Switzerland, which is about skills. Because Harriet, it's great to hear that you haven't had that kind of comment made to you before, and therefore were so surprised that it was unusual. And perhaps for those of us who've been playing with these tools for a while, some of those bits that we're teaching the mediators might be useful for everyone by way of skill. And the first thing is not just people are really good, because why not? That should be a given that the male and female are the same.
Yeah.
So how does one change a perception or a bias, particularly an unconscious one, and without having to break your own relationship or rapport with that individual? And the first thing that I would say is talk to them about the kind of research that's been done in the boardroom about groupthink. And talk to people about how the kind of idea of getting a mediator who is just like us, or just like the most senior lawyer on each side, or just like the client, isn't necessarily the best approach for best decision making. And within the room, if the team doesn't look to be a team that is a balanced team, talk to your client about it. Talk to them about groupthink. And hopefully, if you are getting to the stage of ever going to a mediation, the mediator, who is a sort of modern style mediator, will be actively coaching in each room and holding the mirror up in relation to bias. Because we all know that when unconscious bias impacts on decision making, those decisions deteriorate in quality. And we've seen that in the sort of board think reports that have been being produced, so it's not new news. But in a mediation, that kind of reflection happens in private. And when I do hear the gentleman blah 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 or women's work, actually forget everything else that they've said sometimes and just reflect back that word. So this is a really good skill to have in your pocket. If they say blah 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 blah, well that's clearly women's work, you can just say women's work and leave some silence, because actually most people would be horrified that the words have come out of their mouth in today's world. And I actually had one specifically 2 weeks ago in a mediation where somebody was on a very long I was talking to them privately, and they went on and on and on about the people in the other room. And they said to me, that young girl in the other room, blah, 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 blah. And I didn't take any of the rest of it. I let them carry on to the end, and then I just reflected back those little words. That young girl? And actually, it wasn't about the gender of the person or the age. It was actually about the reputation, the experience, all kinds of other things to unpack. And a mental shortcut had been used to put a whole generation worth of gender bias into the thinking. And actually, reputation was something we could work with. Experience and the right people in the room, that was something we could work with.
Yeah.
But actually, the right person to be in the room was perhaps not that individual, but it was her female boss. And so actually, they're real life tools that we can use to make sure we call it out in a way that allows us to keep those all important relationships intact.
Brilliant. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to turn to the individual questions now, but I'm actually going to flip the order a little bit from what I might have asked before. So turning to Harriet, if that's okay. An imposter syndrome style question. So imposter syndrome, I know a lot of people have, and I think quite a lot of people hold their hand up and say they have imposter syndrome, which is a form of, I think, self-bias in a way. My question is basically, have you personally experienced this yourself in your career, and do you have any experiences to share whereby you have overcome that feeling?
Okay, so I think my first point on this is, can we just all remember that imposter syndrome is not only experienced by women? So just this is a really interesting debate, but it's one that seems to me to span across genders in a way that maybe some of the other stuff we've been talking about hasn't. So the other thing, which may or may not interest some of you, is that, you know, Wilberforce, chock full of like some clever people, and I love my colleagues who are all bright and wonderful and brilliant. Absolutely tons of them probably have what people would label imposter syndrome. They're like capable and marvelous, but they, you know, they're all suffering from it to some degree. The boys too. So I just really want us to remember that when we start talking about imposter syndrome, because I think actually this is a kind of gender shared thing. It's, you know, this isn't just about women, and I think that's important to remember. Have I personally experienced it? Yeah, I think probably. I mean, in the sense that I cannot quite believe that I'm in a set that I'm in, that I deserve to be. I can't believe the cases that I get to do sometimes. Seriously can't believe it. And to the point where I'm kind of like, wow, someone's entrusting me to deal with this. Are they mad? I mean, that stuff is their thoughts. They go through my head. So yes, if that counts as imposter syndrome, which I think in some descriptions of imposter syndrome it does, then yes. Is it a lack of confidence? There's an interesting debate. Can some of it be cured by improving your sort of self-belief and confidence? Is that what it's all really about? Discuss. Maybe Danny and Mandy have thoughts on that, or maybe you guys have questions about it. Do I have an experience to share whereby I overcame that feeling? So where I went to in my head is that insofar as what I've described might count as imposter syndrome, I would say that I probably felt that more acutely when I was starting out. Because insofar as it was precipitated by feelings of insecurity or disbelief as to my, ability to qualify and get to the bar and have a place in chambers and all that stuff, I think probably I felt it most acutely at the very beginning, and then when I first joined Wilberforce, being entirely upfront about it. And yet I still have it from those thoughts that I was describing from time to time, but there has been a shift. And so in terms of overcoming that, hard to describe, hard to kind of touch on from a purely kind of anecdotal analysis, but I would say that actually just sometimes looking at my work, or indeed listening to what other people have said about my work and actually hearing it rather than just dismissing it as some, throwaway comment because they're being nice, which, I would tend to do. Actually listening to it, that maybe is helpful, because insofar as what is going on is a sort of self-doubt, or is some manifestation of self-doubt, then, maybe sometimes you just need to do what people that don't suffer from this do. And I was going to say men, but as I said, it's not fair because it's not just a women thing. Like you just have to sometimes go, all right, maybe I did a decent job there. And then with time, perhaps it changes, but I'll stop and let the other two talk on this because there's loads to think about.
Anything extra to share, Mandy or Danny?
I just agree with Harriet. It's not a female thing. I know as many men, but yeah, I suffer from it. I remember my biggest bout of it was when I was told I was taking on the merged real estate disputes team of, you remember that Nabarro, Allswang and CMS came together 5 years ago. In fact, it's probably 5 years around this period. I realized there was something going on when I realize now when I'm feeling nervous or anxious and the imposter syndrome had kicked in, because I scraped the skin off my fingernails. I sit there doing that, and my husband was like, "What have you done?" Because they were bloody, they were awful, and I had to stop and check in on myself because if there's a physical manifestation of it, and I realized the anxiety, and I was like, "But it's me. I'm not 40. I can't do this." And you're like, you have to, as Harriet said, you have to sort of start holding a mirror up to yourself. Why have you been given this opportunity? You must have something, and whether that's talking to somebody else. I talked to my fellow partner at CMS. I talked to my coach, because I've had a coach for quite a number of years, because you're in the position because you are doing something right, and it's about remembering that you are capable, you're respected, and that's why you've been offered this opportunity. And it's not because you can't do it, it's because you can do it. But it's really hard sometimes to think that. So I think it's about checking in on yourself to overcome it.
Self-championing yourself, I think.
Yeah, you do, because sometimes no one else will do it for you, so you've got to do it for yourself.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so a question actually for you, Danny. Going back to the actual topic itself, have you witnessed firsthand or even secondhand any conscious or unconscious bias during your career, do you think? And can let us know a bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've touched on it in originally. I think I was thinking about it. There was some stuff in lockdown, and I think that is unconscious bias because it was in that circumstances totally, innocently setting meetings at times of the day where everybody's world had just shifted, and you had to think about everybody. And I think that is, you have to think about everybody's sort of family lives all of a sudden, more so than you would do if we were on the office. And I think I do put that down as unconscious bias, but it wasn't necessarily just targeted at women, although a lot of the women had to sort of take the lead on making the lunches and that kind of thing in that scenario. And I'm not saying it was, it was everybody with children had an issue at that time, but everybody had different issues, whether you had family or not. And I think the pandemic's done a lot. Personally, I've been lucky. I know I have been lucky, and I've had a male sponsor, pretty much my entire career, who has stood behind me, has pushed me forward, has helped me get to partnership, has helped me in my role as head of department. and I'm very lucky about that. Of course, I've seen things, but I'm quite strong-willed, and I just say it how it is sometimes. I think the unconscious bias, and it's probably linked, I think Mandy made a point there. I feel it more about my age or reflection. People look at me and go, "You're not old enough to do this," and maybe it's a gender thing as well, because would they say that about a fresh-faced guy? Don't know. But the amount of times I've even had a client, "Are you old enough to be doing this? Have you got enough experience to do that?" Would they ask a man? Probably not. Or the other side, and woe betide another side underestimates me, because if I get a sense they think that I'm, haven't, in all my years of experience, I've never had somebody take this point, well, I will really take the point then. So yes, I've had it, but did I look at it and think that was a gender thing? Probably not at that time. I thought you're being ageist, but it probably is a gender thing when you take a step back.
Danny, one of the underestimating, sorry to chip in, one of the underestimating you thing because of your woman age, whatever it is that's going on in their head. That's one of my favorite things, because
I know. I'm like, right.
More than being like, yes, you're gonna die.
I have done it. And
I actually love it. I'm just like, this is so funny.
I rise to the challenge, and I'm like, you've thrown the gauntlet down, and you're going to regret this. And the best thing, there is a male solicitor, very very old school solicitor still out there, and it was so funny. I'd gone against him, and I'd had him say, "Oh, in all my years, and blah blah blah, you're not old enough to do." And I came up against him another time. But my client had got into a tailspin. "Oh, we need a really aggressive person on this, because I've heard the other side has got this really ultra aggressive person." And I was like, "Tell me who it is. I can be aggressive." And they told me who it was. I burst out laughing, and they were like, "Well, that wasn't the reaction that we wanted." I was like, "I will run circles around this guy, trust me, because I've had him on the other side and he underestimated." So they put me on the job, and he just went, "Oh no, not her again," and caved. The client was just like, "What happened?" And I love that, because sometimes, but I recognize I am quite bolshy in that sense of just giving it to the client. But, I'm like, "Harriet, you throw a gauntlet down like that and you're rude, I'll step up to the mark and I'll show you."
Brilliant. One more individual question coming to you, Mandy, before we end on I think a big question that all three of you can turn to if you can. So Mandy, as a mediator and woman, what advantages has this offered to you, do you think, over male mediators, if any, over your career?
Now, interesting question. Because actually, I'm not sure I look at things with that personal characteristics and versus gender stereotypes. Because you've said what the question is, as a mediator and a woman, what advantages have I got over a man who's a mediator? Well, individually, I've got loads of personal characteristics that I would love to talk about, but actually they are mine, and I try to not fit with those gender stereotypes. And the more that we can do that, the better. When I look at that word cloud that I showed earlier, with those sort of perceptions that the softer skills are perhaps better in the women breed and the more action-based focus is better on the male side, well, what feedback do I get from clients? Often it's about energy and drive and focus. Of course I've got some of those softer things, but that's how one defines a good mediator as opposed to a gender stereotype. So that's the first little point I'd make. I think we all need to be careful about those own personal perceptions and also the wider ones. So I'll have a woman because she'll be better at relationship building, for example. How about I'll have Harriet because she's really good with clients, or Danny, as opposed to putting those gender stereotypes in. Now, that said, I'm so sorry for going back to research again, but there is the research that says our brains are slightly wired differently in general. Now, that can't be the same. I'm sorry, they haven't checked out every woman and every bloke to find out, but there may be some actual chemical or genetic or human differences between the ways our brain works. I know some really empathetic, incredibly powerful relationship builders in the male mediator world. And I know some incredibly action-focused, feisty. Now, there's a word that's only used for women and not for men. I once had that in one of my appraisals in the noughties, that one of the things I needed to tone down was how feisty I was. Again, I don't think that would have been in a male appraisal.
Mandy, have you ever been called uppity?
Uppity, feisty, stroppy, these are all words that define action-focused women. And actually, that is starting to change, but we can call those kind of words out. Uppity, stroppy, etc. So
I invert it. I affectionately refer to myself as uppity junior sometimes. Because I'm like, I just find it amusing. I'm sort of like, well, let's call it out, and kind of each to their own.
And just be very, it's being careful with our own choice of language, which can impact particularly those coming on behind us. If people in senior positions are using that kind of language and that kind of gender stereotyping language, it doesn't help everyone coming below to get it right. Because one of the things I would say is that diversity is something that we all need to focus on and have active in our brain. And it won't just work itself out. The level of intervention might be different. You look at South Africa at certain periods, you look at the sort of all-female lists. I'm not going to get into the politics of what is right or wrong, but actually we can all be cognizant and we can all improve our skills on calling it out and on relationship building. And what I'm really interested in is while Harriet was talking, whilst having one ear on what she was saying, I looked at the screen. And we've got 57 people here, and I can count the number of males on one hand. Now, this topic today is not a female's topic. And I wonder whether something might be said in a property litigation type email thing, saying we were really interested to see that, the vast majority of people who came were female. For next year, it would be great if the discussion could be a balanced discussion or something like that. You perhaps can put it in much better words than me. But actually, if each and every one of you here, and particularly looking at the males on the screen, provide that allyship to others, it's not a women's problem to invite the blokes. I think this is a conversation for everybody.
That leads me very nicely on to the final question. We've only got 8 minutes left. So if you could give everyone your thoughts on the final one, which is, for a lot of younger members and juniors, are starting out in their careers, it can sometimes be hard to find a way to speak up or find the confidence to challenge stereotypes, both in the workplace and actually in our personal lives as well. So what advice would you give to our junior members on the steps they could take to help break the bias, which does lead on from what you just said, Mandy, I think. But Harriet and Danny, do you want to add anything else?
Well, maybe I'm not answering the question directly, but one of the big things that I've been a firm believer in is finding your voice. So that's not copying Danny's style, that's not copying anybody's style. It's about you and the way you express yourself and being confident in how you express yourself. And something that I've been doing a lot with junior partners across the firm, because it's you can work your career and then you want to then emulate somebody. You think, oh, I should be more like that person, and I do it at junior level and as well. But so for me, it's helping people become confident with the way that they are. Now, I don't use big convoluted words and I don't expect anybody else to, but if that's the way you want to speak, then that's fine. And you be confident and you own it, and giving people the permission to find their style and to project their style and become their own, I think for me is the thing that I champion.
Thank you.
I completely agree with that, and actually my answer was going to be essentially a version of that, because I sort of linking back to something Mandy was saying earlier about she has her characteristics. I thought about this too when thinking about what to talk about today and views on things. And some people have said to me, "Oh, you're quite a male female." I'm not sure what that means. I mean, I do think I know what they mean, but this echoes precisely what Mandy's saying. It's that, oh, I happen to have some traits that are sort of stereotypically male, one might say, but hey, I'm a female, and you know, maybe I have some traits that are like that too. Actually, it's all just my traits. And so my voice, and I think when I think about what has changed within me that maybe has made a difference to some degree to my practice, my relationship with clients, all that stuff, part of it is to do with finding who I am, how I draft documents, how I, you know, deal with conferences and being junior counsel, how I deal with my colleagues, teams, lawyers I'm working with, professional clients. And so much of that is wrapped up in for me, it's wrapped up in exactly what Danny was just identifying. It's wrapped up in this kind of notion of really getting to grips with who you are and how you want to sort of do things. But let's go back to another point and highlight this, because I think it is also something that is about what advice would you give? I think we've all got to bring men into this discussion much more than, and we're going to have to do that because, as Mandy has rightly pointed out, you know, 95% or whatever the statistic is of this group of people is it's women. Now, how do we do that? That's a challenge. Well, small things that I do is that I actually talk to my male colleagues about this kind of stuff from time to time, not all the time. I'm not completely preachy about it. I don't shout at them about notions of bias and all the rest of it, because actually, for the most part, I think things have improved. But I did talk to a few of my male colleagues in the lead up to today's panel and say, oh, I'm doing a International Women's Day panel discussion on Thursday. And I sort of said, if you were asked to do something like that, would you come along? There were mixed responses. But we need to do a bit of that, don't we? We need to talk a little bit to those who are our contemporaries that are of the other gender, and also bring some senior people into the discussion. Now that is challenging, and I'm not sure I've worked out the answer of how you do it, other than at the moment for me, it's a kind of let's have the discussion. Let's try and draw them in. But yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, that's actually the end of all the submitted questions. I'm not sure, Lawrence, if you've had any questions come in at all from anyone else watching. To
be honest, I think we've covered it all off really nicely. There were a few questions, and I think Harriet and in particular sort of covered them off just now. So I think we'll call it a day there. Time's almost up. I'm conscious that everyone's probably very, very busy, but I'd just like to say that was a really interesting discussion. Personally, I really enjoyed listening to it. I think we could have gone on for a considerable length of time and much longer. An hour doesn't really seem enough, to be honest. It doesn't quite do it justice, I don't think, but it was certainly very interesting. There's a lot to think about, and it's given myself, and I'm sure everybody else on the call, a lot of pause for thought and introspection. So I'd just like to thank all of you for taking part. Mandy, Danny, Harriet, thank you so much. Emily, great job. Well done for hosting. Thank you very much. Thank you for everybody for attending. If anybody does have any feedback on the event, please don't hesitate to contact the JPLA, Emily or myself, or anybody that you know that's on the committee, because that feedback's really valuable and it will allow us to put on future events that we know that people are interested in and that will be suitable for everybody. The recording will be up shortly, so if anybody wants to pass that on to colleagues, friends, then please do, and just stay tuned for further events that the JPLA will be putting on. As I say, maybe next year we'll be doing things in person a bit more, and if any of you are in Oxford for the PLA conference at the end of the month, we may see each other then. So it just leaves me to say thank you again to everybody. Have a great day, and goodbye. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.